The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open with a rush of cold night air, and the sound of another ambulance pulling away echoed in the parking lot. Inside, the waiting area was lit too brightly for the late hour, every corner smelling of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Behind the reception desk, a nurse tried once more, her voice raised just enough to cut through the noise. "Ma'am, can you tell me where it hurts?" The older woman standing at the counter didn't answer. She was small, dressed neatly in a dark coat, her hands folded in front of her as if she were standing in a temple instead of a hospital. Her lips moved, but the words were soft and foreign, a melody of Japanese syllables that fell into the air and disappeared. The nurse glanced at the security guard hovering nearby, then at the growing line of patients behind her. "She's not responding in English," the receptionist muttered under her breath. "I've tried 3 times. Someone in the line sighed loudly. Another person shifted with impatience. At the far end of the hall, pushing a cart stacked with trash bags and a mop, Elliot Barnes slowed his steps. He was used to blending in, used to being the figure people passed without noticing. That was the point of his job: clean the corners, clear the mess, move on. But something about the way the woman stood, still, polite and yet quietly unravelling, made him pause. He watched as the nurse tried again. "Do you need an interpreter? Spanish? Mandarin? We can call one." The woman lowered her eyes and whispered another phrase in Japanese, almost like a prayer. The nurse sighed, and the security guard took a small step forward. "Should I escort her to the side?" he asked. The air in the waiting room tightened. People were watching now, heads turning, whispers rising. And in that tension, Elliot saw something he recognised far too well. The look of being treated like a problem when all you wanted was help. He set the mop handle against the wall. His shoes squeaked slightly on the linoleum as he crossed the room, each step drawing the attention of patients and staff alike. The nurse frowned. "Sir, this is hospital business. You don't need to—" But Elliot didn't answer her. Instead, he stopped a respectful distance from the woman, bowed his head just slightly, and said in a voice low and careful, "Daijobu desu, you're safe here." The sound of those words seemed to rearrange the space. The woman's eyes lifted, sharp with surprise, and for the first time since she entered, she did not look alone. The nurse blinked, confused. The guard froze. Even the chatter in the waiting room seemed to pause. And for Elliot, standing there in his grey uniform with the scent of bleach still on his hands, it wasn't about showing off or stepping out of line. It was simply about being seen, and making sure she was too. The woman's eyes softened at the sound of her own language. She whispered a few words back, hesitant but clear. Elliot nodded, repeating them with the ease of someone who had practiced long ago but never forgotten. The nurse leaned closer, baffled. You understand her?" "Enough," Elliot said quietly. "She's asking if her medicine is safe. She's worried it was lost in her bag." The nurse hesitated, then hurried off toward the counter to check. The security guard stepped back, glad for the excuse to avoid a scene. The woman's shoulders loosened a fraction, and Elliot gestured toward a nearby chair. "Let's sit," he said in English first, then repeated the same in Japanese. His accent was rusty, but the intent was clear. She followed, settling into the chair with careful grace. Elliot crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level so she didn't feel cornered. He pointed gently to his own chest, then to her, and asked in simple Japanese, "Pain? Where?" Her hand lifted, trembling, and pressed against her side. Elliot gave a small nod, repeating the word she used so the nurse nearby could hear, "Stomach." The nurse scribbled notes, relief flickering across her face. For the first time that night, the woman's expression shifted. Gratitude was there, but also something else. Recognition. Like she had been invisible a moment ago, and now, through a few fragile words, she existed again. "Arigato," she whispered, "thank you." Elliot dipped his head, just enough to acknowledge it. "It's okay, you're safe." The receptionist returned with a clipboard and the woman's small purse, setting them carefully on the table. Inside, a plastic bottle of pills rattled faintly. Elliot read the label and repeated the name aloud so the nurse could confirm it matched the record. Everything slowed down. The tension in the waiting room eased, patients returned to their own worries, and the crisis shrank from a spectacle back into a moment of care. The nurse gave Elliot a long look. Where did you even learn Japanese?" Elliot straightened, picking up his mop handle again. "A lifetime ago," he said softly. "It's a little rusty." But before he could step away, the woman spoke again, this time more urgent. Her voice lifted just enough to draw a few stares, and Elliot turned back quickly, catching the word. She said a name, Kenji. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, as if she expected someone to walk through at any second. Elliot frowned, repeating the name under his breath, tasting its weight. Whoever Kenji was, she needed him. The automatic doors remained closed. No one came. Elliot met her gaze, saw the fear returning like a tide, and knew the night wasn't finished. The name still echoed in his mind as he wheeled the cart back down the hall. Kenji. The way the woman whispered it carried more than worry. It carried longing. "Barnes?" Nurse Paula caught him near the elevator. "I've worked with you for months, and I never heard you speak a word of Japanese until tonight. Where did that come from?" Elliot hesitated, gripping the mop handle like it was a shield. He could have brushed it off with a joke. That was usually safer. But Paula's eyes weren't mocking. They were curious and maybe even a little respectful. "I used to teach," he admitted quietly. "Community college. Linguistics mostly. I had a class once on how different cultures use silence. I thought I'd spend my life in classrooms." Paula blinked. "You were a professor?" "Not really," he said, shaking his head. "No office with my name on the door. Just evening lectures, tutoring sessions, helping nervous freshmen find their voices. That was enough for me." He didn't add the rest. That his wife Emma had been the one who pushed him to keep teaching, that she used to sit in the back row during his lectures and smile whenever he lost his train of thought. He could still see her there, hair pulled back, thermos of tea in her hand, tapping her pen along with the rhythm of his words. When the illness came, he had stepped away. First a semester off, then another, until he realised he wasn't going back. By the time Emma was gone, the classroom felt like another lifetime. Now instead of chalk dust, his hands smelled of bleach. Instead of essays, he carried trash bags. It was quieter this way, and for years he had told himself he needed that quiet. But tonight, with one whispered name, all that quiet felt heavier than ever. He left the hospital at dawn, the city just waking, and drove his old sedan across town. The apartment lights were still on. Inside, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her. She looked up, her face pale with worry. "Dad," she said before he could set down his keys, "I can't do it. I can't stand up in front of the class tomorrow." "Do what?" he asked gently. "The presentation. 3 minutes in front of everyone. My stomach hurts just thinking about it." Elliot sat beside her, pulling the notebook closer. The page was nearly blank, just a few erased lines and smudges of pencil. He thought of the woman at the hospital, unable to make herself understood. He thought of Emma, teaching him that sometimes the hardest part wasn't what you said, but daring to say anything at all. "Listen," he said softly, "you don't have to have a speech, just 3 words. Pick the 3 things that make you feel safe and start with that. No one can take those away from you." Charlotte frowned. "That won't make sense to anyone." "It doesn't have to," he replied. "It just has to make sense to you." She tilted her head, studying him, the way she sometimes did when she knew he was speaking from a place deeper than his smile. She didn't press further. She only nodded slowly, tucking the idea away. Later, after she went to bed, Elliot lingered at the table. He flipped to the corner of her notebook and wrote down one word, neat and small, almost like a secret. Kenji. He didn't know why the name unsettled him so much, only that it felt like a door half open, waiting for him to step through. The apartment had settled into silence, but Elliot couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the faint glow of the alarm clock, listening to the hum of the refrigerator through the thin walls. It was almost midnight when he heard the soft shuffle of bare feet. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. "Can I stay with you?" she whispered. Elliot lifted the covers and nodded. She climbed in, curling against his side the way she used to when she was little. He smoothed her hair back and waited. She always needed a few minutes before the words came. "I'm scared," she said finally. "What if everyone laughs when I try to talk tomorrow?" Elliot took a slow breath. He knew that fear too well, the fear of opening your mouth and giving people another reason to dismiss you. "Do you remember what I told you earlier?" he asked. 3 words, she murmured. "Right. Pick 3 things that make you feel safe. It doesn't matter if anyone else understands them. Those words are for you. When you say them out loud, it's like carrying your own shelter into the room. Charlotte tilted her head to look at him. What were your 3 words? Elliot hesitated. The question landed deeper than she knew. Once, his 3 words had been Emma, books, home. But Emma was gone, and books and home had both felt fragile since. He kissed the top of her head instead of answering. I'll tell you someday. For a while they lay in the dark, listening to the city outside their window. Just when her breathing began to slow, Elliot's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He frowned, sliding it open carefully so it wouldn't wake her. The hospital's number glowed on the screen. He stepped into the kitchen to answer. A tired voice on the other end explained that the older Japanese woman from earlier, the one who had clung to his words, had woken again, confused and asking for someone. She had repeated one name over and over, Kenji. Elliot glanced back toward the bedroom, where Charlotte was finally drifting to sleep. He felt the pull of 2 worlds, the one that needed him at home, and the one that seemed to be calling him back. I'll be there soon, he said quietly. He hung up, slid on his jacket, and picked up his keys. Before leaving, he scribbled a note and placed it on the counter where Charlotte would see it first thing in the morning. Back at work, be brave, choose your 3 words, I'll be thinking of you. With that, he stepped out into the night again, unaware that both his daughter and the silent woman at the hospital were waiting for him to keep the same promise. The automatic doors sighed open once more as Elliot walked back into the emergency ward. The night was quieter than before, but the air still carried that heavy mix of disinfectant and fatigue. Nurse Paula spotted him first. "Barnes?" Her voice carried both relief and disbelief. "I thought your shift was over." "It was," he said, adjusting the strap of his jacket. "You called." She exhaled, half smiling despite herself. "She's in the observation room, keeps saying the same name, Kenji." Elliot nodded, following Paula down the hall. Through the glass, he saw the older woman sitting upright on the bed, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching and finding no one she recognized. He stepped inside slowly, careful not to startle her. The moment she saw him, her shoulders softened. She spoke a stream of Japanese, quicker now, desperate. Elliot raised his hand gently, asking her to slow down. He caught enough to piece together her meaning. She was afraid she had misplaced her pills, afraid her son wouldn't find her in time. "Daijabu," he said softly. "It's okay, we found the medicine." He lifted the small bottle from the table beside her and showed it to her. Her eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed before. "Safe," he added, repeating the word in both English and Japanese. She whispered something back, a word he hadn't heard in years but understood instantly. Shimpai, worry. He sat on the chair by her bed and answered in her language as best he could. "Less worry, you are not alone." The room grew still. Paula stood quietly in the doorway, arms folded, her usual sharpness gone. A young doctor leaned against the counter, scribbling notes but watching Elliot with quiet respect. For a long moment, it didn't feel like a hospital room at all. It felt like a small island of peace, built from simple words. Then, with hands trembling slightly, the woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. She pressed it into Elliot's hand. On it was written a number, underlined twice, Kenji's cell phone. Elliot looked up at her. "You want me to call him?" She nodded, eyes shining. He stared at the paper, then at her, and something tightened in his chest. He thought of Charlotte asleep at home, clutching her blanket, whispering her 3 words to no one but herself. He thought of how much weight a single voice could carry. "All right," he said gently, "I'll call him." He stood, slipping the paper into his pocket, and gave her one last reassuring bow of his head. Behind him, Paula muttered almost to herself, "You do more in 5 minutes than we manage in hours." Elliot didn't answer. He just pushed open the door, already dialing the number, knowing the next voice he heard might explain everything. The call had been brief. A man's voice, clipped and hurried, had answered on the 3rd ring. When Elliot explained who he was and that his mother was in the hospital, the silence on the other end carried equal parts fear and frustration. "I'll be there," Kenji said at last, and the line went dead. Half an hour later, Elliot saw him stride through the hospital doors. The man looked younger than he expected, dressed in a wrinkled suit, tie loosened, phone still in hand. His shoes clicked sharply against the tile as if he was trying to outrun his own guilt. "Mother!" Kenji called, his voice carrying down the corridor. Elliot stepped forward. This way. When Kenji entered the observation room, his mother's face lit up in relief. She whispered his name like a prayer. Kenji went straight to her bedside, but instead of a soft greeting, the words tumbled out sharp. "Why didn't you tell me you were travelling alone? You should have called me. Do you know how dangerous this was?" The woman flinched at his tone, lowering her eyes. She murmured a reply in Japanese, quiet but firm. Elliot caught just enough. She hadn't wanted to bother him. Kenji rubbed his forehead, his jaw tight. "You always do this," he said, switching to English, more for himself than for her. "You hide things until it becomes a crisis." Elliot cleared his throat softly. "She said she didn't want to be a burden. That's why she kept quiet." Kenji turned on him sharply, eyes narrowing. "And who exactly are you? A janitor who suddenly speaks Japanese? Why would she open up to you instead of me?" The words stung, though Elliot had heard worse in other hallways, in other lifetimes. He met Kenji's glare with steady calm. "I didn't take your place," he said quietly. "I just listened when she needed someone to." Kenji blinked, the fight draining from his face as he looked back at his mother. She reached for his hand across the blanket, her fingers trembling, her lips whispering again. Elliot translated gently. "She says she was more afraid of making you tired than of being sick. She didn't want to add to your load." Kenji's shoulders sagged. His voice broke as he said, "The only thing I'm afraid of is losing her." The room grew still. The woman's eyes softened and she squeezed his hand, finally allowing her tears to show. Elliot stepped back toward the door, giving them space. Kenji looked up at him again, but this time there was no accusation in his eyes, only something closer to gratitude, though he couldn't quite say it. "Why did she trust you?" he asked again, softer now. Elliot paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Because I listened." And then he left them to the kind of silence that heals instead of divides. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds of the small apartment. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table in her school clothes, staring at a piece of paper with lines scrawled across it. Elliot poured cereal into 2 bowls, his eyes heavy from the long night at the hospital. "You don't have to write a perfect speech," he said gently, setting a bowl in front of her. Charlotte didn't look up. "Everyone else has paragraphs, mine's just 3 words. Elliot smiled faintly. Sometimes 3 words are enough. At school, the classroom buzzed with chatter as kids fidgeted in their seats. On the board, the teacher had written, "Presentations today." One by one, students walked to the front, reading carefully crafted pages while their classmates half listened. When Charlotte's name was called, her stomach twisted. She carried her paper to the front but didn't unfold it. She glanced toward the back, half expecting to see her dad, even though she knew he couldn't be there. Still, she heard his voice in her head. "Pick 3 things that make you feel safe." Her hands trembled, but she took a breath. "Sky," she said softly. "Mint. Home." The class went still, then a few kids smiled, not mocking but curious. The teacher leaned forward. "Would you like to explain?" Charlotte shook her head, her cheeks pink. But her voice didn't break when she added quietly, "They're mine. They make me feel less afraid." The teacher gave a small nod. "Thank you, Charlotte. That was brave." She walked back to her seat, heart pounding, but lighter somehow. She didn't need applause, she just needed to know she had spoken out loud and survived. At the end of the day, she ran out of the school doors and saw her father's old sedan waiting by the curb. She climbed in and closed the door with a sigh of relief. "Well?" Elliot asked, glancing over. "I did it," she said simply, 3 words. He smiled, pride tucked into the corners of his tired eyes. "That's all it takes?" She looked out the window, then back at him. "Did you use your words last night?" Elliot tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He thought of the woman whispering Kenji and the son who finally admitted he was afraid of losing her. "Yes," he said softly, "I did." Charlotte didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. The silence in the car was warm, not heavy, but Elliot knew deep down this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, for both of them. The invitation came on a folded flyer, slipped under Elliot's door by Mrs. Diaz, the receptionist from the hospital. Community night at the library, helping neighbours communicate in crisis. At first, Elliot thought it was a mistake. His name wasn't on the flyer, but her note was clear. People could learn from you. He almost tossed it aside. He wasn't a speaker anymore. He mopped floors. He blended in. Standing in front of strangers felt like standing under a spotlight he had long since walked away from. But Charlotte found the flyer on the counter that evening. "You should do it," she said between bites of pasta. "I don't know," he murmured. "Dad," she said, looking him straight in the eye, "if I can stand in front of my whole class with 3 words, you can stand in front of a few people at the library." That settled it. A week later, the small community room was filled with folding chairs and the faint smell of instant coffee and store-bought cookies. A dozen people gathered, older folks, a couple of nurses from the hospital, even a young man who had overheard the scene in the ER that night. Elliot stood at the front, hands pressed to the edges of the podium as if it might hold him steady. His voice was quiet at first, but honest. "Most of us don't think about language until it fails us," he began. "But in moments of fear, even simple words can feel impossible. Sometimes the best thing we can do isn't to talk more, it's to slow down, notice and listen." He demonstrated what he had done with the older woman. A few simple gestures, a single repeated word, patience instead of panic. The room nodded along, understanding that it wasn't about knowing Japanese or Spanish. It was about dignity. From the back row, a small hand went up. "Charlotte." Elliot froze for a second, his breath caught. "Sweetheart." She stood, holding the little notebook she always carried. Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "My dad taught me something," she said to the room. 3 words. If you're scared, you pick 3 things that make you feel safe, then you say them out loud, even if your voice shakes. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes on her. Charlotte glanced down at her notebook, then lifted her chin. "Sky Mint home." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she finished it. A smile tugged at the corners of Elliot's mouth, pride swelling in his chest. One of the older men in the front row clapped softly, then another joined. Soon the whole room was applauding. "Motsui!" Not loudly, not like a performance, but warmly, like neighbours recognising courage. Charlotte sat down, her cheeks flushed, and slipped her hand into her father's. Elliot looked at her and whispered, just for her, "Brave." And for the first time in years, standing in front of a group of people, Elliot felt like he wasn't hiding anymore. The week after the library talk, things felt different in the hospital. Elliot noticed it first in the small nods from people who never used to look twice. A nurse passing in the hall gave him a smile that lingered. A patient's family member whispered thank you as he emptied a trash can, though he wasn't sure what exactly they were thanking him for. Paula, the night nurse, caught him by the supply closet. "Barnes," she said, "you don't realise what you did. People saw you with Mrs. Tanaka. It reminded us all what real care looks like." Elliot shrugged. "I didn't do much." "Sometimes," she said, "that's exactly what people need." But not everyone felt the same. Later that shift, in the break room, a younger custodian named Rick tossed a paper cup into the trash and looked at Elliot with a smirk. "Must feel nice," Rick said. "All this attention for saying a few words in another language. Half the hospital thinks you're some kind of hero now." Elliot kept his eyes on the vending machine. "I'm no hero. I was just there at the right moment." Rick leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, well, some of us just stick to our jobs. Maybe that's why we don't end up on a pedestal." The words weren't loud, but they landed hard. Elliot felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't argue. He picked up his mop and left the room in silence. Walking down the quiet corridor, he thought about Charlotte standing in front of her class, trembling but steady, speaking her 3 words. She hadn't cared whether anyone clapped, she'd just wanted to be brave. At home that night, Charlotte sprawled on the living room floor with crayons scattered around her. She held up a picture of a stick-figure family under a big blue sky. "This is us," she said proudly. "You, me and the sky." Elliot crouched beside her. "The sky?" She nodded. "It's always there, even when we're scared. That's why it's one of my words." He smiled, touched by her certainty. But then she set the crayon down and studied him. "Dad, are you scared now that people see you more?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about the nods, the thanks, and also Rick's smirk. He thought about how being noticed sometimes felt like a gift, and sometimes like a spotlight he didn't ask for. "Yeah," he admitted. "A little." Charlotte tilted her head. "But maybe they're not just looking, maybe they're listening." Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. That night he sat alone at the kitchen table. In front of him lay the library flyer someone had scribbled on. "Would you come back and share again?" He stared at it for a long time, the room quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. For the first time in years, Elliot didn't just feel afraid of being heard. He felt the faint pull of wanting to speak. The letter arrived tucked between bills and coupons, the kind of thing most people would overlook. Elliot unfolded it at the kitchen table and read the neat handwriting slowly. "Thank you for speaking just enough, Aiko." It was only one line, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken that night. He set the card down carefully, as though it might break if handled too roughly. The front door opened and Charlotte came in, her backpack sliding off one shoulder. She dropped into the chair across from him, pulling out a sheet of paper. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "Dad," she said, sliding the paper over, "we had to do the 3 words again at school today." Elliot leaned forward, curious. "And what did you choose this time?" She grinned, proud but a little shy, and pointed to the words written in her small, careful handwriting. "Dad, brave home." For a moment, Elliot couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his hands resting on the paper like it was something sacred. "You put me in your words?" he asked softly. Charlotte nodded. "You're one of the things that makes me feel safe. That's what this was all about, right?" The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, warm, almost glowing. Elliot reached across the table and squeezed her hand, the same way she squeezed his when she was scared. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, they stepped outside together. The air was cool, the sky streaked with soft gold and pale blue. Charlotte tilted her head back and pointed. "See? The sky's still here." Elliot looked up with her, and for the first time in years the sight didn't make him feel small. It made him feel steady. Charlotte slipped her hand into his, giving 3 quick squeezes in their new code. "We're safe," she whispered. Elliot smiled, watching the horizon fade into night. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we are." And with that, they stood side by side under the wide, endless sky, not needing to say more, because some truths, once spoken, kept echoing long after the words were gone. True strength isn't found in loud voices or big titles. It's in the quiet courage to listen, to speak with honesty, and to make others feel safe. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you were in this story, what would you have done? Or what 3 words would you choose to feel safe? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them.